Yes,
for
I think
your
that is,
system?
yes.
Well, I should explain that I worked in the World Bank as a staff economist for several years in the 1980s, and subsequently have done a lot of research and writing in the World Bank about what you could call the underwear politics, the underwear politics in and of the World Bank. So against that background, when I read this book, I really did find it a breath of fresh air. It makes a big advance on what has long been the standard approach to development thinking, not just in the World Bank, but in other organizations, including our esteemed own DFID, namely to formulate and then help governments implement best practice in various kinds of domains. But one question that arises from the sheer subtlety of Brian's typology and the argument that makes the typology work, one question that arises is to what extent that kind of approach might be influential in the World Bank. And the reason for the question is because the World Bank and other such organizations have a very powerful inner imperative to embrace a kind of best practice, one size fits all, a single recipe for all developing countries with then qualifications at the margins. And one sees this, for all that Danny Roderick and now many other economists say, nobody believes the Washington Consensus anymore, quote unquote. That is flatly not true, and one sees that it is not true from operational procedures of the bank, such as the doing business reports, such as the country policy and institutional assessment formula. These two things both score countries according to the goodness of their policies and institutions for development, commonly in the CPIA on a score from 1 to 5. And the question is how you get the best score, 5. And it turns out that you, the country, get the best score for trade policy, for labor market institutions, for a whole lot of other things, if you follow the one single best set of best practices, as in the Washington Consensus. Free trade, no trade unions, and so on. That gets you the best score. So, but the point is, this is not a kind of accident. There is an inner imperative in the very functioning of the bank to think in this kind of single recipe way. I won't now go into the reasons why there is this inner imperative, but if you wish, we can come back to it. But the fact of the matter is there is an inner imperative, and it would be very difficult, I think, for the whole kind of epistemological approach that Brian adopts to be made consistent with the operational practices of the banks. But in terms of conceptualizations, it is a very big advance. Secondly, it's a very big advance on the mainstream of institutional development economics, as in Douglas North, as in the more recent book by Acemoglu and Robinson. And I just want to read out a quote. Actually, I saw this quote in Brian's book, and I was really shocked when I read it. So this is what Acemoglu and Robinson say. Authoritarian growth is neither desirable nor viable in the long run, and thus should not receive the endorsement of the international community as a template for nations in Latin America, Asia, and Africa, attempting to engineer prosperity without confronting the root cause of the problems, namely extractive institutions and the politics that keep those institutions in place. That is unlikely to bear fruit. When I read that, I thought about my experience in East Asia. I've done a lot of research in various parts of mostly capitalist East Asia. All those cases developed under forms of authoritarian growth, what they call authoritarian growth, for long periods. The period of fast catch-up, like for 30 years or so in post-war Japan, in in Korea and Taiwan was under fairly authoritarian or very authoritarian growth. And so this is an example, I think, of them engineering political conditions for fast growth backwards from the case of the already developed countries, the point which Brian was talking on. I want to go on then, having said in what ways this book makes a big advance on two very common ways of thinking in development studies. I want to go on and make, I think, an important qualification. And the starting point is this, that the book's time horizon is 1 decade, 1 decade. And its focus is on growth, governance, growth, interactions over the space of a decade, with the causality running mainly, not only, but mainly from governance variables to growth, and then, yes, back from growth to growth of the middle class, back to governance, and so on. But there is a problem here, I think, which is that Brian's interest in formulating configurations along his typologies which will produce sustained growth, but growth over the period of 1 decade, does tend to ignore a very fundamental point, and the point, empirical point, and the point is brought out in the recent paper by Lance Pritchett and Larry Summers about growth volatility. Other people earlier, Sanjay Reddy, for example, have brought out the same point. And the basic point, as in the Pritchett-Summers paper, is, and this is a quote, there is almost no statistical basis for predicting growth from 1 decade to the next. Or, as they say, also, current growth has very little predictive power. So a country that grows fast in 1 decade is unlikely to grow fast in the next decade. So that's the first point. There's almost no statistical basis for predicting growth from 1 decade to the next. Second point, as they say, this is Pritchett and Summers, quote, the single most robust and striking fact about growth is regression to the mean, and the mean is about 2%. And the third finding that they advance is this: growth at more than 6% for more than a decade or more, is very uncommon. And the fourth point is that the East Asian capitalist cases, post-war Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, are very exceptional. They each managed 6% growth or more for around 30 years. But recently, China has broken their world record. So China is now the world record holder because China has grown, this is not GDP per capita, but total GDP, at more than 6% for 35 years so far. But China is the world record holder. This is completely exceptional, and of course, under very authoritarian rule, or what Asimoglu and Robinson say, authoritarian rule of the kind that they say is not viable in the long run. Well, 35 years is quite a long time. So all that is on the one hand. You have this empirical record of very volatile growth decade by decade. In other words, beyond the period that Brian is thinking of. The problem then is that government policies and government institutions, all the governance variables that Brian talks about, tend to vary little from 1 decade to the next. They are relatively stable. And so it becomes then apparently rather problematic to say that these governance variables are explaining either high or low growth, because growth is so unstable. In other words, the explanatory power of the variables that Brian is talking about, explanatory in terms of explaining growth rates, may be rather less than is implied in Brian's book. And maybe that's got something to do with the fact that the span of attention in the book's analysis is simply 1 decade. And that may be argued that is actually much too short.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.